Throughout the summer and into the autumn, paper moved steadily, if sleepily, across the landscape, carried by men on horseback, and sometimes by men without horses. It was delivered to old stone buildings, to wooden offices with sagging beams, to rooms lit dimly by tallow candles and smelling faintly of mildew and starch. The wax seals were often broken slowly, with small knives or even by hand, as no one was particularly eager to read what was inside. Most letters said nothing new. Many said the same thing twice, with slightly different phrasing. On one occasion, 2 sets of orders were sent to the same regiment. One instructed them to prepare for immediate departure to the Caribbean. The other told them to stand by for action on the Irish coast. The commanding officer read both letters, narrowed his eyes, and decided to do neither. Instead, he spent the week writing poetry about fog. One of his verses read, "The cannon sleeps beneath the tarp. The sword is dull with dust. If war must come, then let it yawn and rise, if rise it must." The poem was sent to the Admiralty. It was never answered, and so, by the end of 1739, Britain had on paper mobilized for war. Entire armies existed in ledgers. Ships had been reassigned in memos. Rations had been calculated in elegant columns. But in reality, almost nothing had moved. Soldiers remained in their barracks, playing cards and brushing lint from their uniforms. Horses chewed hay with the slow detachment of creatures entirely removed from international affairs. Cannon sat in mud, angled politely toward nothing in particular. And clerks, heroic clerks, continued to sharpen their quills and write more orders to this day. Historians remain somewhat unclear on when precisely the British military mobilization for the War of Jenkins' Ear actually occurred. Some say it was never completed. Others argue that it was completed several times, each version contradicting the last. But all agree that no war effort in history has ever produced more paper per volley fired. The march that went nowhere. Welcome back to boring history for sleep. Tonight, we follow a regiment as it bravely prepares to go somewhere, and then doesn't. A tale of movement postponed, of enthusiasm slightly dampened, of orders received with an expression somewhere between confusion and polite dismay. This is the story of a military march planned carefully, mapped out precisely, uniforms pressed, boots shined, and spirits, middling only for it all to dissolve into a kind of stationary pause. No drums beat, no flags waved. But there was a great deal of standing around, and several remarks about the condition of the road. The 14th Coastal Regiment, assigned to the vaguely defined southwestern front, if it can be called a front, given that no Spanish forces had yet been sighted within 100 miles, received its marching orders on a Thursday morning of such persistent drizzle that even the local dogs refused to go outside. The orders, written in careful, bureaucratic prose, instructed the regiment to advance from their encampment just outside of Tavistock to a more strategically favorable rise of land near Lidford, roughly 15 miles distant. The phrase, strategically favorable, was never defined, and in fact may have been a diplomatic euphemism for someplace less muddy, or perhaps simply uphill, where it looks impressive. Nevertheless, the orders were received, unfolded, and read aloud in a tent that smelled distinctly of wet wool and boiled onions. Major Quentin Willoughby, who, despite his title, had never seen battle, and had in fact once fainted at the sight of an improperly laced boot, took it upon himself to organize the march. He began with a speech, delivered not from horseback, but from a small wooden crate, as his horse had wandered off the night before, and was last seen standing motionless in a nearby pond. The speech was not rousing. It included several hesitations, a brief tangent about the health benefits of walking, and a stern reminder to step smartly, but not too hastily, lest one slip. The men, who numbered just under 100 and whose average age hovered around 47, nodded with the blank, resigned look of those who knew exactly how far they were not going to get. They set off after lunch. It had been decided that a full stomach would aid morale and discourage mutiny. The meal consisted of slightly rehydrated salted cod, coarse bread, and something called field gravy. which was neither fluid nor flavorful, but did have the admirable quality of sticking to the inside of one's mouth for hours. Boots were laced, cloaks were tied, and several men retrieved their walking sticks, not out of necessity, but because they had grown used to the idea that every military action might as well involve at least a little leaning. The regiment moved. Slowly, partly because of the mud, but also because of the general mood, which was neither hopeful nor particularly grim, but somewhere in the agreeable lowlands of mild inconvenience. The road they followed had once been maintained by someone with a shovel and a dream, but time and weather had reduced it to a series of squelches punctuated by puddles of uncertain depth. Within the first mile, a wagon's wheel stuck in a rut, so deep that two privates spent 20 minutes arguing about whether it would be easier to go back and find a plank or simply abandon the wagon altogether. They decided to leave it, which meant that all remaining supplies had to be redistributed among the soldiers, which in turn led to further discussion about whose back was already a bit tender from the last campaign, which, if one were honest, had involved more waiting than walking after 6 miles, a journey that took nearly 4 hours, including a break to mend a bootlace and a pause to inspect what turned out to be a completely ordinary squirrel. The regiment reached a low, misty copse of trees near a bend in a stream. It was not, strictly speaking, the designated location, but it did feature a soft patch of grass, a naturally occurring windbreak, and a sense collectively felt that this was probably far enough for one day. Major Willoughby, upon being informed that the sun was beginning to set, looked skyward and said something about light conditions no longer favoring progress. No one questioned this. Several men were already setting up tents. The fog began to thicken as evening arrived, not dramatically, not like in novels, but with the slow inevitability of a blanket being laid down one thread at a time. The trees, thin and knobby, stood like old men in the half-light, doing very little. Someone remarked that they might be elm, but no one could say for certain. A sergeant boiled water for tea and discovered that the tea had been packed without leaves. The water was still consumed as warmth now counted for more than flavor. Boots were removed with quiet groans, and one soldier spent several minutes wringing out a sock. As if in mourning at the officer's tent, there was a brief and muted discussion about whether to press on in the morning or remain in camp another day to assess terrain conditions. Lieutenant Charles Pembroke, who had recently finished reading a thick novel about Roman logistics and now considered himself an expert on supply chains, advocated for caution. He pointed out correctly that the map they had been given contained several rivers that no longer existed, and at least one hill that, upon closer inspection, turned out to be a clerical shadow. It was agreed that, barring emergency or sudden inspiration, no movement would be undertaken until further notice. A message to this effect was drafted, and immediately lost in the folds of someone's cloak. The night passed without incident. Unless one counts a brief commotion involving a misplaced lantern and a curious badger, there were no gunshots, no drums, no alarms, just the occasional cough, the rustle of canvas, and the deep, patient breathing of men who had not truly expected to get anywhere in the first place. Someone sang a lullaby to himself, softly and slightly off-key. Another man dreamed, vaguely, of turnips. Morning came gray and indifferent. The fog had not lifted. The grass was wet again. The horses looked unimpressed. A corporal approached the major and offered to organize the next stage of the march. The major waved him off, saying he would prefer to wait for further clarity. None arrived, and so the 14th Coastal Regiment remained. For 4 days, they did not advance, they did not retreat. They simply occupied. The phrase holding position was used in reports, which made it sound like a decision had been made. It had not. The only truly notable event of the week was when Private Emerson lost a button and then found it again in his boot. The button was celebrated quietly. Back in London, no one noticed the delay. A copy of the movement order was still sitting on a clerk's desk, awaiting duplication. Someone was meant to seal it with red wax, but the red wax had run out, and blue was being considered, though that raised issues of precedence. Meanwhile, Major Willoughby, standing just outside his tent and watching mist curl gently around a tree stump, began drafting a letter titled Observations on Static Encampment as Strategic Patience. He believed, wrongly, that it would be published, and so ends the march that went nowhere. A gentle shuffle into nowhere in particular, a 6-mile expedition paused not by enemy fire nor by urgent danger, but by damp trousers, disagreeable road conditions, and a widespread but unspoken agreement that perhaps it was just fine to stop here. War is declared. Sort of welcome to boring history for sleep. Tonight, we begin a journey through one of the most profoundly unremarkable wars ever recorded in the sleepy scrolls of human conflict. It is a war named, rather dramatically, after Aenir. Yes, Aenir. A small, wrinkled, entirely severed ear. Preserved allegedly in a jar of spirits. Presented with minimal ceremony to the British Parliament in the spring of 1738, the owner of the ear, one Captain Robert Jenkins, had lost it some 7 years earlier, during a minor squabble with Spanish coast guards off the coast of the Americas. Why the ear was kept, or why it was shown to Parliament so many years later, no one truly knows. Some say it was symbolic. Others say it was pickled, but that is neither here nor there, because even as parliamentarians furrowed their powdered brows and shook their wigs in practiced dismay, nobody was entirely certain if war had actually been declared. There were speeches. Oh yes, many speeches, delivered with elegant slowness and a great many clauses. Some speeches blamed Spain. Some speeches blamed the weather. Others blamed economic treaties, maritime policies, or simply the Spanish tendency to patrol their own coastline, which, to be fair, was very near British merchant routes in drawing rooms and salons, over weak tea and biscuits that tasted faintly of chalk. Noblemen and naval officers nodded, along as someone mentioned something about honor. But mostly people just sighed, and made plans to visit the country for the summer in April of 1739. A formal letter was written, a declaration of war. It was a letter with long sentences, ornate phrasing, and several flourishes of ink. It was signed by important people with important titles, none of whom had ever seen combat, nor wanted to. The letter was sealed with wax, and then it was sent, slowly, by courier, who was unfortunately detained by weather. By the time it arrived in Madrid, Spain had already begun writing its own letter. A letter of protest about British trading practices in the Caribbean. A letter which had not yet been finalized because one of the secretaries had taken ill with gout, and the minister in charge had decided to take a short holiday to Andalusia. And so, for several long weeks, nothing happened at all across the Atlantic. Colonial governors received vague notices about upcoming hostilities. Troops were instructed to prepare, but not to engage, unless provoked, and only with sufficient cause, unless the orders changed, which they might soon. Commanders waited for clarification. Clarification never came. In the port towns of southern England, sailors lingered around barrels, listening to rumors and wind. Was there a war? Maybe. Were they going to sea? Probably not yet, but possibly soon. Somewhere near Portsmouth, a customs officer stubbed his toe on a crate of Spanish sherry and declared it a strategic insult. Even that failed to escalate back. In London, the Admiralty held a quiet breakfast to discuss the logistics of war. There was bread. There was ham. And there was, of course, a lengthy conversation about biscuit allocation ratios for distant ships. Someone mentioned Worms. Someone else mentioned tariffs. The meeting ended early, as a light drizzle began to fall. And so the world crept into war, like a man crawling into a lukewarm bath he's not entirely sure he meant to draw. No flags were raised. No trumpets blared. Just quiet, soggy paperwork. It would be another full month before the first orders for naval mobilization were fully written. Even longer before any ships actually left their docks. Because first there had to be inspections, inventories, Reevaluations. The matter of biscuit supply came up again, and whether dried peas were more suitable than salted cabbage. Most of Parliament forgot the war had technically begun. Some assumed it had already ended. Even Captain Jenkins himself, the man with the missing ear, was nowhere to be found. He had apparently taken up gardening, and so in the long summer of 1739, a war was declared, sort of. But life, for the most part, continued with this steady hum of uneventful days. Children played in the fields. Horses nickered. The sea rose and fell, and in a small office in Bristol, a naval quartermaster stared at a list of ship names and wondered quietly whether H.M.'s Weasel was a dignified enough name for warfare. Spoiler, it was not. But it remained on the list anyway. Mobilizing the paperwork. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we continue our exploration of a war so gentle, so muffled by procedure that entire months passed without anyone lifting a musket, much less firing one. Tonight, we enter that most quietly heroic chapter of every military endeavor. Not the battlefield, but the back office. The quill. The inkpot. The memo written twice. Welcome. To the mobilization of the paperwork. It began, of course, with a letter, or rather with a copy of a letter. The original had been misplaced by a junior scribe, who later claimed, perhaps, not untruthfully, that he'd used it to line the inside of his boot during a particularly damp day. And so a second version was drafted, this time on heavier stock parchment, with the proper margins and flourishes. The phrase immediate dispatch of troops was underlined twice in a shaky hand, though nobody seemed quite sure which troops or where they were meant to be dispatched. The order was sent by carriage to a small naval office in Plymouth, where it sat for a full 5 days on a desk beneath a pile of biscuit manifests and a dead moth. By the time the paperwork was noticed, the officer in charge, a man named Bertram. Smallwood, who had once fought in a minor skirmish against a very angry goose, frowned that he could not decipher the handwriting. The ink had run during a rainstorm, and the salutation, which may have originally read to the Right Honorable Commander of Naval Affairs, now resembled something closer to the bright hamper of canal Afghans, rather than risk sending men to the wrong canal, or worse, the wrong continent. Smallwood penned a cautious inquiry. It was a masterwork of polite uncertainty, expressing grave respect for the Crown's intentions while asking, in the gentlest possible terms, what exactly those intentions were. That letter took 9 days to reach London, not because the roads were particularly treacherous, but because the courier stopped frequently to water his horse, enjoy small stews, and wants to purchase a pair of slightly discounted breeches. By the time it arrived at the War Office, the man in charge of correspondence had already been replaced, due to what was vaguely described in a memo as a discrepancy involving stationery. His replacement, Mr. Alfred Gibbons, was known for his meticulousness and for once refusing to sign a requisition for him, because the date had been written in smudged graphite rather than indelible ink. Gibbons received Smallwood's letter with the slow inward sigh of a man who had read a great many confused inquiries and expected to read many more. Gibbons began the great task of clarification by referencing a ledger known as Book 4A, subsection D, mobilization of forces, colonial, and coastal pending diplomatic conditions. Unfortunately, subsection D had been borrowed the week prior by the Department of Ship Naming and had not been returned. It was eventually discovered under a tea tray in the map room, slightly warped by heat and bearing a faint ring of Earl Grey. Once retrieved and dried near the hearth, Gibbons consulted it only to find that the relevant tables had been amended with a pencil, then crossed out in red ink, then amended again in blue, and finally labeled obsolete, see revised protocol, 1735. The 1735 protocol, it turned out, had been lost in a fire, or possibly in a filing error, or, according to one secretary, misplaced in a reshuffling of the alphabetical cabinet system during the moth incident. At this point, it was generally agreed that more copies should be made, and so they were, dozens of them. stamped, initialed, corrected, and countersigned. Most were wrapped in twine and sent to regional offices, where they were opened with solemn reverence, read aloud to uninterested assistants, and then carefully filed away in drawers already full of equally unread letters. In Edinburgh, a colonel's aide attempted to make sense of the orders, but paused midway through to attend a christening and never resumed. In Portsmouth, a sergeant looked at the dispatch, shrugged, and poured himself another mug of something. Murky and brown, he said aloud, "Well, it doesn't say not to wait," and promptly did dot. Meanwhile, the question of actual troop assembly remained unresolved. Technically, regiments could be drawn from several locations across Britain. Practically, this meant someone had to write to each garrison and ask how many men they currently had, how many boots still had solace, and whether any of the officers had recently died. Replies came in slowly, often in the form of notes scribbled. In the margins of unrelated reports, one post read simply, "Still raining. Horses anxious. Rations low. No visible Spaniards." Another, from a sleepy garrison in Wales, asked whether the war would interfere with harvest festivals and if special allowances could be made for hay fever, even where numbers were clear. Logistics were not. Several regiments were technically assigned to the West Indies, though none had ships available. A requisition for transport was submitted, then rejected, because the ship in question had been promised to a cargo mission involving pineapples and unfinished chairs. A compromise was reached involving half of a schooner, 2 rowboats, and a confused captain who had only just returned from a completely unrelated expedition in Nova Scotia. This plan was immediately delayed because nobody could find the oars. Camp life without a battle welcome back to boring history for sleep. If you're just joining us, don't worry, you haven't missed much. In fact, very little has happened. And tonight, we visit the gentle lull that followed the march that mostly didn't happen. We find our regiment, the 14th Coastal, quietly encamped in a field just south of Lidford. Their boots muddy, but still mostly intact, their orders vague, and their ambitions at this point modest. No one is shooting. No one is storming any forts. Instead, there are potatoes to peel, socks to dry, and mild disagreements about tent placement. This is not the storm before the calm. This is the calm that just continues. Life in camp, as it turned out, was composed almost entirely of waiting. Waiting for updated orders. Waiting for wagons. Waiting for the tea to steep. There was, at first, a sense of anticipation that perhaps tomorrow would bring a message, a sign, or at least a rumor of movement. But as the days wore on and no such signs arrived, the men settled into something more stable and enduring than excitement, routine. Mornings began not with bugles, but with coughing. The fog, still persistent, would lift only slightly by mid-morning, revealing rows of tents in uniform formation, each one faintly sagging at the corners like an old man's cheeks. A few fires were permitted, but only under supervision, and so most meals were taken cold, or, if one was lucky, lukewarm from the kettle of the regimental cook, whose signature dish was a grayish mash politely referred to as stew. Casks were assigned not with military efficiency, but with the slow, bureaucratic drawl of officers who had run out of synonyms for tidy. Boots were to be cleaned every other day, mess kits inspected, uniforms brushed with stiff horsehair tools. That raised more dust than they removed. The men did these chores with the resigned thoroughness of people who had realized, slowly but fully, that they would not be going anywhere soon. A man could spend 20 minutes polishing a button, not because it needed polishing, but because it gave him something to do while the wind made soft whistling sounds between the guy ropes. Occasionally, something unusual would happen. A chicken would escape from the supply pan and run between the tents, pursued not with urgency. A small puddle would be mistaken for a musket shot, and for one glorious moment, several men would stand, back straight, ready to respond until someone would say, "It was just water," and they would return to their stools, their shoulders easing back into place. On one notable afternoon, Corporal Bixby sneezed so violently that he dropped his cup. For the rest of the day, that incident was referred. Tio as the loudest occurrence since arrival, the officers naturally fared slightly better. Their tents were larger and included folding tables upon which they could spread their maps, most of which were outdated or incorrect. A hill marked on one chart turned out to be a slight rise, barely noticeable to the eye. A bridge that was supposed to cross a small river had never existed at all. Still, there was a kind of comfort in poring over these maps with furrowed brows, nodding sagely, and muttering things like, "We'll need to consider flanking routes," even though there was no enemy in sight and no particular evidence that one would arrive. Some officers took to writing letters, most of which began with phrases like, "Still encamped," "All is quiet," "Weather as before." Others attempted to write poetry, though their work was often interrupted by drafts or, more commonly, by boredom itself. One afternoon, a minor dispute arose regarding the placement of the officer's privy. It had been moved apparently without authorization by a junior lieutenant concerned about wind direction. This led to a small flurry of notes exchanged between tents, followed by a short meeting in which the issue was discussed for nearly 45 minutes. No resolution was reached, but the privy was left where it was, on the logic that moving it again would be disruptive to morale. Health became a subject of quiet interest. Private Tilly developed a cold, which, given the lack of other events, became something of a camp-wide affair. Men inquired after his temperature. A blanket was offered. A sergeant claimed, with great solemnity, that he had once read of a man dying from camp sneezes, though no one could recall where or when. Tilly, for his part, sat beneath a tree, and sniffled politely, touched by the attention, but quietly longing for solitude. He recovered in 2 days, at which point interest in his condition dropped precipitously. Mail arrived sporadically, but it was welcomed with disproportionate joy. A single letter from home could be passed around, discussed, even admired. One soldier received a parcel containing a small wheel of cheese, and for a full afternoon, men visited his tent to observe it, sniff it, and offer completely unsolicited opinions on its aroma. It was eaten the next morning, slowly, with reverence. The crust was saved and used to flavor stew for the rest of the week. There were drills, of course, because some semblance of military order had to be maintained. But these were carried out with minimal enthusiasm. The men practiced marching in a large, slightly squishy circle, their boots making faint sucking sounds in the mud. Rifles were lifted, aimed, lowered. Not firing ammunition was limited, and no one wanted to waste it on nothing in particular. A captain attempted to give a speech about readiness, but was interrupted by a sneeze, and then, curiously, forgot what he had been saying. Evenings in camp were perhaps the most poetic time of day, not because they were beautiful, but because they invited the mind to wander. As the light dimmed, tents glowed faintly from within, lit by candles whose flames flickered in quiet defiance of the damp. The sounds of the day faded. No more arguments about soup, no more speculation about the Spanish, no more debates about whether that tree in the distance looked suspicious. Just the soft rustle of canvas, the occasional clink of a spoon, and somewhere always the low muttering of a man talking to himself for lack of company. A few men smoked pipes. Others wrote letters they would forget to send. Some simply lay on their cots, staring at the ceiling of their tents, thinking of not much at all. And so the days passed like pages in a blank book. Not wasted exactly, but not filled either. Nothing advanced, nothing attacked, and nothing collapsed. The war continued in name, if not in action somewhere far away, perhaps at sea, or in Parliament, or not at all. Here, in this camp, there was only the long, slow rhythm of waiting, and peeling, and wiping mud from boots that would never quite be clean. A skirmish that didn't happen. Welcome again to boring history for sleep, where the battles are theoretical, the tactics hypothetical, and the excitement strictly optional. Tonight, we recount the gentle non-thunder of a skirmish that never took place. A moment of nearly something, followed swiftly by carefully orchestrated nothing. It was a brush with the idea of conflict felt from a distance, contemplated deeply, and then, by mutual consent and prevailing wind direction, politely sidestepped. This is the story of two groups of soldiers who spotted one another on a foggy hillside, and, after much internal deliberation, decided to retreat at exactly the same time to the same degree, with the same careful avoidance of incident it began, as so many almost events do, with a miscommunication. A scout young, enthusiastic, and regrettably nearsighted spotted what he believed to be a column of Spanish troops descending the northern slope of a hill known locally as Old Woman's Elbow, a name whose origin no one could quite recall, though there was general agreement that the hill was neither particularly old nor elbow-shaped. The scout, whose name was Jonathan Wren, had been sent out with instructions to report any enemy presence or suspicious movement. What precisely counted as suspicious was never clarified, and so, when he saw a vague clump of uniforms in the distance, vaguely moving in a direction that could have been north, he did as instructed and ran back to camp, waving his arms and gasping. Out reports of imminent engagement dot the officers gathered in a huddle near the biscuit crates. They squinted toward the hill. Mist swirled lazily at the edges. Something was moving, but whether it was a military formation or a herd of sheep engaged in an unusually coordinated migration, no one could say. Major Willoughby, ever the cautious sort, opted to ready the troops just in case. This meant, in practice, that several men were woken from naps, boots were reluctantly relaced, and muskets were removed from canvas wrappings with a sense of ceremonial obligation. A drummer boy was told to stand by. He did, with arms folded and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else got at roughly the same time. On the opposite slope, a small detachment of Spanish troops, approximately 28 men, under the command of one Captain Diego Salazar, were also surveying the field. Their objective, officially, had been to map the terrain and determine whether there was a passable trail through the marsh below. What they found instead was the indistinct outline of tents and figures across the rise. Captain Salazar, a man of great restraint and even greater distaste for noise, peered through his spyglass and saw just enough movement to make him deeply uncomfortable. He was not sure how many enemy troops there were, or whether they were prepared to fight, but he was entirely sure that any engagement in this saga, Featureless Valley, would be both logistically irritating and strategically meaningless. And so both sides began to prepare for a confrontation they had no real interest in conducting. The English soldiers formed a slightly wobbly line, taking care not to stand too close to the muddy patches while the Spanish arranged themselves behind a line of shrubbery that offered no real cover but gave the appearance of intent. It was, in its way, a kind of silent duel of posturing, each side observing the other with the grim seriousness reserved for staring contests and diplomatic luncheons that the standoff lasted for the better part of 90 minutes. During this time, several important things happened. A raven landed near the center of the valley and pecked at something invisible. A private on the English side sneezed and apologized. Captain Salazar sent a runner to check whether their flintlocks had been properly dried after the previous day's drizzle. They had not. Meanwhile, on the English line, Major Willoughby considered whether now might be the right moment to issue his long-planned speech about duty and preparedness, but ultimately decided against it, as no one looked particularly receptive, and he hadn't memorized the ending. Finally, as the sun began to sink into its late afternoon sulk, something settled. Shifted. It is not clear which side moved first. Perhaps it was simultaneous. Perhaps it was merely coincidental, but one line began to inch backward, casually, almost apologetically, as if hoping not to be noticed. The other line, seeing this, took it as a cue and also began to retreat. There was no sound, no command barked aloud, no flourish or fuss. Just a mutual, unspoken agreement that whatever this was meant to be, it had been quite enough. Both sides withdrew slowly, in reverse, trying not to make it look like retreat. No one turned their back outright. It was a choreography of dignified disengagement, a dance of non-escalation. Once the troops had vanished behind their respective ridgelines, the field returned to stillness. The raven remained briefly before, losing interest and flapping away. That night, both camps drafted reports. On the English side, the incident was recorded as a potential skirmish with enemy presence on the northeast approach, avoided due to strategic repositioning. The Spanish report, somewhat more lyrical, described it as a moment of cautious observation, followed by tactical withdrawal in the interest of preserving strength. Neither side mentioned that no shots had been fired, nor that the entire event may have been based on a shared misunderstanding. The War Office in London received the report 3 weeks later and placed it in a file labeled Field Engagements Minor. It was never referenced again, and so the skirmish passed into the fog of history, where it sits quietly even now, an encounter that wasn't a moment suspended between two armies too polite to fight. No medals were awarded. No songs were written. But for those who stood in the damp grass that day, waiting for something to begin, there is perhaps a vague memory of shared uncertainty and the quiet dignity of doing almost nothing. Together, diplomats write letters, welcome back to boring history. For sleep, where tension is low, correspondence is high, and the only thing advancing is time itself. In our last episode, two armies met briefly, ambiguously, and then agreed, without speaking, to go away. No shots were fired. No boots were scuffed unnecessarily. It was, in every way, a perfectly forgettable moment, but naturally the lack of action could not go unrecorded. And so, in the days that followed, pens were uncapped, candles were lit, and an altogether different kind of theater began, the quiet, delicate ballet of diplomatic letter dash writing it is a truth rarely acknowledged outside the dustier corners of the archives that much of warfare, particularly in the 18th century, occurred not on the field but on parchment. The moment anything almost happened, someone, somewhere, was obliged to write about it. Reports, responses, retractions, observations on wind direction, clarifications about tone. Entire paragraphs devoted to the presence or notable absence of hostile gestures, in this particular case, after the skirmish that wasn't. A British adjutant named Percival Blanchard was assigned the task of drafting the initial notice to be sent to the Spanish command. It was a thankless sort of duty, and he approached it with all the enthusiasm of a man tasked with describing an event he didn't witness, involving people he didn't quite know and which by most accounts didn't actually occur. Blanchard wrote slowly, carefully, and with an eye for what he called formal balance. His handwriting, trained in the long tradition of boarding school precision, featured tight rounded loops and evenly spaced lines, though the ink occasionally pooled when the candle flickered too hard. He began with, "To the esteemed officers of His Most Catholic Majesty's colonial forces," and paused for nearly an hour after that, chewing gently on his quill and occasionally muttering things like, "Incursion feels too strong." Perhaps mutual visibility. In the end, he settled on a phrase that would come to define much of the correspondence during this war. "It has come to our attention that your forces were briefly observed at a considerable distance on what may or may not constitute contested terrain." Satisfied, he went on to express that no aggressive action had been taken, but that the proximity of our respective encampments may give rise to unintended implications, and that the British command, while wholly uninterested in escalation, would appreciate clarity of intent with regard to future patrols. He signed it with a flourish. In mutual respect and unshaken decorum, LTP, Blanchard, Royal Adjutant, Coastal 14th, and sealed the letter in red wax, pressing it. With a crust that had partially melted due to improper storage, it resembled a jellyfish more than a lion. But the symbolism was considered acceptable. The letter was entrusted to a courier named Tom Buckle, a man known chiefly for having once delivered a ham safely across 3 counties in the rain. He set out at dawn on a borrowed mule named Harriet, who stopped frequently to chew on bark and once refused to cross a shallow stream until coaxed with an apple core. It took Buckle 4 days to reach the Spanish outpost, and when he did, he was informed that Captain Salazar was away on survey duty. The letter was accepted by an aide who immediately placed it in a drawer, intending to read it later, after lunch. It remained there, unopened, for nearly a week. When it was finally read, it caused something of a stir, not because of its content, which was vague and entirely inoffensive, but because it used the word proximity 3 times in one sentence, and no one present could quite agree on what was meant by it. One lieutenant, who had studied at a seminary before turning to military service, claimed it was a veiled threat. Another believed it was a mere geographical observation. In the end, they decided to compose a response that was equally noncommittal. The Spanish reply, penned by Lieutenant Andres del Rio, began with, "We are in receipt of your esteemed message and extend our compliments in kind." It went on to state that any presence on ambiguous ground was entirely incidental, and that Spanish forces had no wish to complicate matters through misinterpretation of landscape. The tone was warm, perhaps too warm. The British, upon receiving it, were unsure whether this meant the Spanish were apologizing, ignoring them, or inviting tea. A second letter was dispatched to request clarification. This letter took even longer to arrive, as the new courier, a man named Edmund Feathers, had a habit of stopping at every roadside tavern to ask for directions, even when the road had no. Turns dot, and so the weeks passed. Letters were written, revised, rephrased, rewritten. Some were lost entirely. One reportedly fell into a cooking pot during a rainstorm, where it was boiled with cabbage and then mistakenly eaten by a sergeant. Others were duplicated, sent along multiple routes in case the original courier was delayed, which he usually was. Every letter opened up new questions, requiring additional letters in return. No one wanted to be impolite, but no one wanted to accidentally agree to anything either. Diplomacy, in this context, became an elaborate, slow-motion dance of excessive courtesy and absolute vagueness back in London. A junior clerk in the War Office was assigned to file these letters in chronological order. He tried. But the dates were irregular, the handwriting inconsistent, and at least 3 of the letters were signed with initials no one could trace. In frustration, he bundled the entire correspondence under a single heading, Misc, West Indies, possibly relevant, and placed it in a box with other unresolved affairs, including a request for cannon grease that had been misdirected to the Admiralty and a 3-page letter about boots that turned out to be a family recipe for gingerbread. Meanwhile, in the field, the soldiers remained where they were, unaware of the flurry of paper fluttering invisibly over their heads. To them, the war was still mostly potatoes, mild colds, and occasional rumors of movement that always came to nothing. They did not know that their proximity had caused diplomatic ripples. They were more concerned with whether tonight's stew would have peace, and perhaps that is the true essence of this war, not the grand strategies or heroic charges, but the gentle accumulation of letters, each one meticulously crafted, sent, through rain and sun, only to clarify things that no one was quite sure had happened at all. The Great Biscuit delay welcome, back to boring history for sleep, where the only storms are on shipping manifests. And the most dramatic question one might ask is that mold or just flour? In tonight's episode, we explore a moment of cautious anticipation and gentle letdown, the long-awaited arrival of food. More specifically, of hardtack biscuits. So unremarkable that they became the main subject of conversation for an entire week. Let us return to the British encampment on the edge of the Caribbean coast. The year still stubbornly 1739. The season, indeterminate. It is always somehow just after the rains and just before the heat. The camp was settled near a salt marsh that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and wet rope. By this point in the war, the soldiers had grown used to the long silences between events. A day's most meaningful action might involve the sudden arrival of a letter, a sighting of a seabird not previously catalogued or more rarely a supply ship, struggling in on a tide too low, with sails sagging like tired curtains. Thank you. Willing Thistle had been due to arrive weeks earlier, bringing with it crates of rations, medical tinctures, and a particularly forgettable kind of wine. But delays had occurred, as they so often did. First, a miscommunication at port, then an argument over anchoring rights. Finally, 2 days of sitting just offshore due to a mildly contrary wind that no one wanted to challenge. The sailors on board mostly played cards and wrote melancholy songs about home. The biscuits stacked carefully in wooden crates, sealed with wax paper, and British optimism remained below deck, gently aging. When the ship finally docked, a small party was sent ashore to announce its arrival. They were met not with cheers, but with a sort of quiet, cautious relief, the kind of subdued greeting one might give an uncle who arrives late to a picnic with warm lemonade. Still, supplies were supplies, and the quartermasters emerged from their tents to begin the process of inventory with the weary enthusiasm of men who had done this before and knew exactly how little mystery awaited them. The biscuit crates, when opened, release a smell that can only be described as ancient flour and modest disappointment. The biscuits themselves were square, unseasoned, and deeply reluctant to crumble. Some had cracked in transit, but most retained their unyielding density. A corporal named Timothy Prowse was the first to try one. He bit down, paused, then attempted to chew, then stopped. "It's got texture," he said at last, diplomatically dot by the next morning. It was generally agreed that at least half of the shipment had gone stale, and that a non-trivial percentage showed signs of mold. Not aggressive mold, not the kind that grows in vivid colors and makes its intentions known, but a gentle, fuzzy dusting of something greenish-gray, mostly around the edges, like lichen on an old gravestone. The biscuits were declared edible with reservation, and the men lined up to receive their rations. Each handed 2 biscuits, a pinch of salt, and, on good days, a spoonful of something that might have once been pork fat. What followed were 5 days of slow, repetitive meals, punctuated by long discussions about the biscuits themselves. Were they meant to be this hard? Was the mold dangerous, or merely decorative? Would soaking them in tea help? It didn't. The tea, made from dried twigs and something that might have been lemon peel, only made them tougher. Somehow, there were rumors that a sergeant had boiled his biscuit in stew for 3 hours, and that it had emerged unchanged, like a relic. Someone drew a face on theirs and named it Colonel Crisp. A small group began hoarding the least moldy ones, swapping them under their blankets like contraband. The officers, meanwhile, debated whether to send a letter of complaint to the port authority. Captain Sedgwick composed a draft that included the phrase "culinary insult to His Majesty's troops." But the letter was never sent, as no one could agree whether the mold qualified as negligence or merely the passage of time asserting itself. One night, by candlelight, a young ensign read aloud from a military manual on proper rationing. He paused on a sentence that suggested biscuits should maintain both firmness and favor, then laughed so hard he knocked over his ink. The laughter rippled through the tent like a low tide slow, surprised, and over far too quickly. By the 6th day, something remarkable occurred. The biscuits began to run out. Whether due to miscounting, mice, or enthusiastic disposal, the crates were found to be lighter than expected. A final count revealed only enough for 3 more days of rations. This sparked, not panic, but a kind of weary amusement. Of course, the biscuits would vanish just as they became familiar. Of course, decision was made to stretch them. Each man would now receive 1 biscuit per day, supplemented with boiled root vegetables, a indeterminate species, gathered from the marsh edge. The biscuits, once cursed, were now treasured. Even the moldy ones were salvaged, trimmed with knives that had previously been used for boot repair. A strange fondness developed. In the end, the biscuits were not remembered for their taste, of which they had none, but for their reliability. Their sheer obstinacy and the brief sense of routine they provided. They came. They disappointed. They were debated. Then they were gone. And in the great arc of the War of Jenkins' Ear. This biscuit delay stood as one of the few episodes that nearly everyone remembered. Not because anything truly happened, but because for a short while the monotony took on shape and flavor. However bland. The unused fort. Welcome back to boring history for sleep, where forts are built without battles. Soldiers stand watch over nothing in particular, and the wind is often the only thing that passes through. In this evening's episode, we turn to an architectural endeavor of considerable ambition and exceptionally little consequence. A fort built on a rise just north of Engrove Swamp, constructed by hand over several weeks and quietly abandoned, before it ever saw use. Some called it Fort Clarity. Others referred to it only as the thing with the walls. Construction began, as these things often do, with a suggestion written in the margins of a longer report. Major Epping, who had not seen action since the mild misunderstanding at Port Maria, some 12 years earlier had proposed that a defensive structure be built in the event of Spanish aggression, which had not yet materialized but was considered theoretically possible. The location chosen was a low hillock, slightly elevated above the surrounding mudflats, offering a commanding view of several uninteresting shrubs and, on very clear days, a glimpse of the sea between two drooping palms. A crew of 40 men was assembled, most of them previously assigned to tent duty or the ceremonial polishing of brass buttons. They began their work on a gray morning when the clouds hung low like damp wool, and the ground was already reluctant beneath their boots. At first, there was some enthusiasm. After all, building a fort offered the appearance of doing something. And for men who had spent the past month debating the merits of various mold patterns on biscuits, the chance to hammer, dig, and lift things was almost exotic. They began by clearing the area, which required the slow removal of stubborn grasses and half-rotted logs, all of which smelled faintly of mildew and wet coins. The fort was to be square or mostly square, though the final layout drifted into more of an uneven parallelogram due to mismeasured angles and a general lack of interest in geometry. The walls rose gradually, assembled from timber salvaged from a supply raft that had run aground the previous winter and been ignored until now. Nails were reused, ropes were tied, and a small watchtower was constructed on the eastern side, facing what was assumed to be the most likely direction of enemy arrival. In truth, there were no clear paths from that direction, only dense thickets and one deeply uncooperative family of raccoons. The tower was accessible by a ladder that wobbled when stepped on and creaked continuously in the wind. Like a chair shifting in its sleep. There were briefly plans to install a cannon. A single one had been located in a nearby warehouse, heavily rusted and partially occupied by nesting spiders. It was transported to the fort by sled and mule, a journey that took the better part of 2 days and ended with the cannon being placed very gently into a corner, where it remained, pointed toward nothing. No one could recall if it was operational. No one ever tried to fire it. It simply became part of the scenery, a metallic gesture toward preparedness. As the days passed, the novelty of construction faded. The work became repetitive, the sun more insistent, and the mosquitoes more organized in their efforts. Supplies arrived sporadically and in odd assortments, 2 barrels of pitch without lids, a crate of wooden pegs meant for furniture, and a spool of pink ribbon no one could explain. Water had to be fetched from a well half a mile away, and the path was often flooded. By the 3rd week, men began requesting reassignment to less labor-intensive duties, such as standing in silence by the camp flagpole or alphabetizing crates of unused lantern wicks. Still, the fort was completed, or at least it reached a state that everyone quietly agreed was close enough. It had walls, a gate, a tower that leaned slightly to the left, and a flag that flapped listlessly on calm days. For 3 days, it was garrisoned by a rotating team of 6 men who sat on upturned crates, watching the horizon for developments that never came. A report was filed stating that visibility remains good. Enemy movements nil. On the fourth day, a letter arrived from headquarters stating that the enemy, if they could be called that, had shifted focus to a region 70 miles east. The fort, it seemed, was now guarding an area of no strategic interest whatsoever. There was a brief debate about whether to continue staffing the post or to leave it as a symbolic structure. A compromise was reached. The fort would be maintained in theory, which meant that no one would be posted there, but if asked, everyone would pretend someone was. A single lantern was left burning in the watchtower for appearances, though. It eventually went out and was never relit. By the time a visiting inspector arrived 6 weeks later, the gates would partially open. The cannon covered in moss and a family of wild goats had moved into the lower barracks. The inspector, a man of thinning hair and abundant paperwork, took careful notes and concluded that the fort had potential historical value. He then recommended that its existence be marked on maps with a small symbol indicating former presence. The symbol was later misprinted as a horseshoe. No corrections were made, and so Fort Clarity built with quiet diligence and modest. Hope became another monument to the gentle absurdity of the war. It never fired a shot. It never defended a thing. It was simply built, then left, like an overly elaborate stage set for a play that was never written. The wrong map incident. Welcome back to boring history for sleep, where every miscommunication is politely filed and every wrong turn is simply a different kind of arrival. In tonight's episode, we follow a regiment that, through no fault of their own and several faults of their maps, marched confidently into the wrong valley, camped there peacefully for a fortnight, and only later realized they were never where they were supposed to be at all. It is a story of cartographic optimism, logistical misalignment, and the quiet serenity of being entirely forgotten. The 14th Light Infantry, known informally as the leftmost column, for reasons no one fully remembered, had been stationed on a low ridge near the coast for some time, where their duties mainly included keeping the flag upright during windy afternoons and maintaining a rotating schedule of latrine inspection, which was taken with far more seriousness than one might expect. Orders arrived one morning, folded twice and sealed with pale red wax, instructing the regiment to proceed inland to reinforce a supply route that was reportedly under threat, though the report itself was vague and possibly out of date. The valley to which they were assigned had a name that sounded either Spanish or made up Val de las Campanas, though no one had ever heard bells ringing there. The map attached to the orders was printed in faded ink and had suffered water damage at some point in its past. Several of the place names had blurred into legible swirls, and one of the compass directions, possibly west, was smeared into something resembling a sleeping rabbit. Still, orders were orders, and the men began their march. They set off in good spirits, walking with that slow, trudging rhythm particular to soldiers who know they will not be shot at today, and probably not tomorrow either. The horses dragged their hooves with a sort of quiet, deliberate indifference, and the mule carrying the camp stove refused to walk in a straight line for more than 3 paces at a time. The map, which had been entrusted to a lieutenant with a reputation for tidy handwriting and poor sense of direction, was consulted frequently and held up against the horizon as though the terrain might politely confirm its identity. After a full day's march, during which they passed 3 identical clusters of scrub trees and a very stubborn duck that refused to yield the path, they arrived at what they believed to be Valle de las Campanas. It looked vaguely valley-like, enclosed by soft, tree-covered hills and bordered by a slow-moving stream. There were no signs of conflict, no enemy movements, no supply wagons. But the grass was a pleasant yellow-green, and the breeze carried a faint scent of lavender and damp canvas. They set up camp. For 2 weeks they remained there, untroubled and undisturbed. Each morning, the officers would gather to review the situation, which remained entirely static. One morning, a private claimed to have seen smoke on the horizon, but it turned out to be mist rising from a patch of sun-warmed moss. Another day, a rabbit ran directly through the mess tent, causing a brief and memorable commotion, but nothing came of it. The men passed the time repairing their boots with lengths of string, writing careful letters home full of omissions and small details, and engaging in extended conversations about the difference between boredom and peace. One sergeant took it upon himself to start a census of the camp's beetle population, and a junior officer began composing a musical suite for harmonica and empty biscuit tin. One night, they held a poetry reading in which someone recited a poem about mud that was later transcribed and sent back to headquarters, where it was lost in a filing cabinet behind an unopened bottle of ink. Back at command, however, a different story was unfolding, or more accurately, not unfolding at all. The 14th had not reported in for several days. A courier had been dispatched but failed to find them, returning with a rather sheepish expression and several mosquito bites. Another courier was sent, this time with a freshly drawn map and 2 canteens of water. He too returned empty-handed, though he did report seeing a valley full of absolutely nothing. Eventually, a clerk reviewing older records realized that the original map, the one sent with the march orders, had been copied from an outdated chart, which itself had been based on a misreading of a Spanish colonial map that may have been a piece of fiction to begin with. Valle de las Campanas, it turned out, did not exist. Or perhaps it did, but several miles to the west. Or possibly in a different province altogether. Still, the 14th remained where they were, continuing their stay in the unnamed valley with quiet dignity. They posted watches, wrote daily reports that no one received, and made a sport of skipping stones across the shallow stream. One soldier carved a chessboard into a tree stump and taught the others to play using small stones and acorns. The air remained cool in the mornings and warm in the afternoons, and the only sounds were bird song, low conversation, and the occasional creak of a rope being adjusted on a tent post. It was, by many measures, one of the most peaceful deployments in the entire war. No enemy ever approached. No shot was fired. No meaningful decision was ever made, when, at last, a scout from a neighboring regiment stumbled upon them, entirely. By accident, while attempting to locate a missing barrel of vinegar, there was a moment of mutual confusion followed by polite disbelief. The 14th was informed, gently, that their presence had not been required and that their original orders had been rescinded several days after they were issued. Apparently, no one had thought to inform them. Or perhaps they had tried, but the letter had been sent to the wrong camp entirely, or placed on a ship that had never sailed, or dropped into a mailbag that was being used to prop open a storeroom door. The 14th packed up their things without complaint. They left the chessboard stump and the beetle census behind. The rabbit that had once charged the mess tent watched them go without interest, and the valley, now as empty as when they arrived, returned to silence, save for the rustling of grass. And the steady murmur of the stream. Weather takes command. Welcome back to boring history for sleep. The only channel where the most decisive actor in a war is the sky itself, and where strategy is often just an umbrella held together with twine. Tonight, we turn our attention not to generals, nor soldiers, nor fleets upon the sea, but instead to the one force that truly shaped the course of events in the muddled pages of this war, the weather. Specifically, the long, low, gray stretch of drizzle that settled over the encampments like a woolen blanket soaked in dishwater 12 consecutive days of mild, unrelenting precipitation, during which very little happened, and what did happen. Happiness. Oh, GG, why died it began, as these things often do, with a single night of light rain, so gentle that it was mistaken for morning dew by those who had fallen asleep with their tent flaps open. The soldiers awoke to find the world dimmed and softened, the usual smells of canvas, tobacco, and unwashed uniforms replaced by the earthy, flat scent of wet straw and damp wood smoke. A few optimists suggested it would pass by noon. By noon, it was suggested it would clear by evening. By evening, no one said anything at all. The drizzle had committed itself, not with thunder or drama, but with the steady certainty of something that knows it cannot be stopped and sees no need to rush. The rain was not hard enough to damage anything outright, but not soft enough to ignore. It was persistent, like an uncle who insists on describing his coin collection in detail and about as inspiring. Tents began to sag. Boots grew heavier. By the hour, the canvas over the latrine trenches took on a sullen tilt and eventually collapsed, not with a crash but a slouch. The officers' uniforms grew mottled, and their journals, those precious leather-bound ledgers of vague intention, and unread dispatches began to blur at the corners. Candle wicks hissed faintly when lit, and then refused to stay lit. Matches salt. Everything was just ... wet. On the third day, a general in the northern sector issued an order to postpone all troop movements, citing inappropriate puddle density. The phrase caused considerable amusement in the mess tents, where men sat, on overturned crates in varying states of moistness, stirring bowls of tepid barley gruel that had begun to ferment at the edges. A debate began half-heartedly, and with no intention of resolution over whether mildew was technically alive, and if so, whether it could be considered an enemy. One sergeant remarked that at least the mold in his boots was showing leadership. Potential dot by the fifth day, socks had become the primary concern. Wet socks, lost socks, socks nailed to tree branches in a futile attempt to dry. Entire afternoons were spent wringing them out, only for them to be soaked again within the hour. Some soldiers began rotating pairs, not for dryness, but for relative squishiness. A pair of engineers took to stuffing theirs with ash and newspaper, an innovation which, while entirely ineffective, did at least give them something to do. One man tried going barefoot and promptly stepped on something sharp, which turned out to be the rusted clasp of an old dispatch case last seen during the second biscuit delay. No one could remember who had written the dispatch, or what it said. Dot letters from home arrived damp, and in one case entirely blank, the ink having fled the page during transit, leaving only the imprint of a fondly remembered handwriting, the faint smell of lavender oil. Still, the recipients read them anyway, filling in the words from memory. One man received a bundle of 3 letters, none addressed to him, and chose to adopt them as his own, inventing a fictional family of mild disagreements and tepid encouragements. It passed the time. The drizzle became a kind of shared rhythm. Boots squelched in unison. Raindrops tapped on tents like an offbeat drummer who never quite found the tempo. A lieutenant, stuck indoors with a head cold and a broken inkpot, began composing verse about the metaphysical properties of dampness. One line read, "Moisture is the thought the sky has when it forgets what else to do." His superior read. It nodded once, and returned to organizing a schedule for cleaning. Already cleaned, new SKETS dot commanders across the various fronts reported similar developments. Nothing could be advanced, retreated, fortified, or scouted. The enemy, wherever they were assumed to be just as wet and equally unmotivated. There were no skirmishes, no bold maneuvers, just puddles forming in depressions not previously known to exist, and men standing quietly under tarpaulins, blinking slowly and wondering if this counted as war. A message from one regiment simply read, "Awaiting dryness." No response was sent because the ink had run out. When the rain finally lifted on the 13th morning, without fanfare, it was not replaced by sun, but by a low, uncommitted mist that hung around like a guest not ready to leave. The ground, having absorbed every last drop it could, gave a long squelch underfoot and then settled into a vaguely sticky consistency. The air was thick and still and smelled of soaked leather and faint mildew, but there was something like relief in it, not joy, not celebration, just the sense that one could perhaps go outside without sinking. A quartermaster went out and inventoried a stack of crates. Someone reassembled a tent. A single pair of socks was seen hanging on a line in the tentative hope of drying. The men had survived the great drizzle, unscarred, uneventful, and more. Or less unchanged dot and so, in this most boring of wars, the weather had its moment of total command, not with hurricanes or floods, not with blizzards or bolts, but with the kind of steady, shapeless drizzle that makes nothing impossible, and everything slightly more difficult. The only thing to advance during those 12 days was political. Arguments back home. Welcome back to boring history for sleep, where tonight's front line lies not on a battlefield, but beneath a chandelier's dusty glow, between long tables and half-drunk goblets of wine, among sighing men in cravats who argue not out of passion, but because it is expected of them. In this chapter, we drift gently into the drawing rooms, council chambers, and overstuffed parlors of the home front, where political debates stretched on into the small hours, not out of urgency, but because the cheese course had not yet been served. While soldiers squelched their way through puddles and dry biscuit rations abroad, the men in charge of the war effort passed their time in repetitive discussions, indecisive votes, and the kind of long-winded correspondence that is best appreciated. By candlelight and a complete lack of haste, it would be inaccurate to say there was no strategy on paper. There were dozens of them, written, revised, rewritten again, and then quietly ignored. These plans were often circulated between ministries, with such frequency that no one could remember who had authored them in the first place. A plan to advance the Western Front was introduced by the Minister of Provisions, who had intended it merely as a metaphor for increasing oat distribution. A naval blockade proposal was put forth during a lunch, where no one could hear over the soup slurping, and at least one land-based invasion strategy turned out to be lifted, nearly word for word, from a satirical newspaper column that had been misfiled under classified suggestions. But none of this caused alarm. It was understood gently, implicitly, that the true purpose of these meetings was not to advance the war, but to maintain the delicate appearance that something might eventually be decided. The politicians, for their part, made a great show of listening. Brows furrowed, heads nodded slowly. Spoons stirred tea in contemplative silence. An MP from the Southern District became famous for a technique known as the thoughtful pause, in which he would stop halfway through a sentence, take a deep breath, and then slowly change the subject. Another representative, widely respected for his consistency, spent every session suggesting a ceasefire regardless of context. Perhaps we might consider peace, he would say, without specifying with whom or over what. These suggestions were always met with murmured agreement, followed by a motion to table the conversation until more tea could be brought in. The Prime Minister, whose name would be largely forgotten in decades to come, and whose portrait still hangs crooked in an unused hallway, had a habit of speaking at length about unity and resolve without mentioning any particulars. His most famous address during the war was a 7-minute sentence that, while grammatically sound, failed to contain a single verb. It was considered his finest hour. His aides wrote it down on vellum, framed it, and presented it to him during a luncheon in which a vote on additional funding was accidentally postponed until the following fiscal year due to a confusion over the definition of immediate. This was not unusual. Dot letters arrived from the front, sometimes 3 at once, sometimes none for weeks. They were often opened, skimmed, and set aside to dry, as many were damp or smudged with an unidentifiable brown paste. Summaries were drawn up. Condensed versions were prepared by scribes who, like the soldiers they transcribed, seemed to lose interest halfway through. One dispatch noted that a fort had been built and abandoned. Another said a regiment had disappeared and might still be somewhere near the mountains or the coast, or possibly neither. A naval report describing unusual dolphin activity was passed around the Defense Committee as a welcome distraction. No responses were issued, but several memos were drafted suggesting that someone else might consider issuing one at a later date. Backbenchers gave speeches, some of which were described as rousing, though only in comparison to the snoring that followed. A particularly enthusiastic proposal to shift resources from boots to buttons was hotly debated for nearly 6 hours before it was revealed that neither item was currently in short supply. One member of the Finance Council suggested that the true cost of the war was not monetary but existential, which was met with quiet nods and a long silence, broken only when someone coughed and asked for more bread. A vote was scheduled to determine whether a vote should be scheduled. That vote failed to reach a quorum, and was thus recorded as inconclusive but amiable. The opposition party, for their part, had very little to oppose. They occasionally asked whether the war was still happening. When told that it was, in a manner of speaking, they would express concern and then recommend a committee be formed to look into it further. Several such committees were indeed formed, but never fully staffed. Their meetings, when held at all, were primarily concerned with reviewing their own minutes and correcting the spelling of minor towns, whose names had changed since the previous map revision. By the end of one particularly damp spring, the committees had generated enough paper to require a new storeroom, which was never built due to uncertainty over who was responsible for approving the flooring. And so the war, if it could still be called that, continued in theory. Not with battles or declarations, but with quiet dinners and slowly melting candles, where well-dressed men spoke in circles, nodded gravely, and agreed that more time was needed. Behind every velvet curtain was another letter unopened, another report unread. The war was, for them, an idea vague, distant, gently inconvenient. Like a cousin's wedding they couldn't quite remember being invited to. It loomed but never pressed. It echoed but never rang. The uneventful naval blockade, welcome back to boring history for sleep, where we now set sail not for glory, conquest, or peril, but for a leisurely maritime standoff that neither blocks nor provokes. In this part of our very sleepy war, we turn to the Navy, the proud, wind-dependent arm of the state, where officers wear wool coats in warm climates. The decks are swabbed more often than the cannons are fired, and the phrase naval blockade is reimagined as something much more ... conceptual. It was, technically speaking, a blockade. The ships were positioned. Orders were given. But to anyone watching from the shoreline, or indeed from aboard, the whole operation might have been mistaken for a floating garden party that happened to last several months. The fleet, once dispatched, arrived with no small amount of procedural flair. Flags raised, logs updated, telescopes polished, and every officer armed with at least 3 contradictory sets of instructions. Upon reaching the designated theater of operation, a phrase that lent the affair an entirely misleading air of drama, they dropped anchor at safe distance from anything particularly strategic and commenced what would become known in some circles as the holding pattern. This consisted primarily of drifting gently with the current, checking their position twice daily, and sending periodic signals to confirm that no one had anything to report. On the rare occasion when sails were adjusted, it was not to pursue or confront, but to avoid particularly rude seagulls or to follow a breeze that might make lunch more pleasant. What made the blockade so very uneventful was not incompetence or cowardice, but an overwhelming abundance of caution paired with an utter lack of clarity. Captains were instructed to assert dominance without provoking hostilities, to restrict trade routes without impeding local fishermen, and to deter enemy vessels without engaging them directly, unless absolutely necessary, which it never was. This led to an elegant kind of nautical standoff, where ships floated within sight of enemy ports, exchanged polite glances through spyglasses, and then resumed their rotations of tea, biscuits, and idle speculation about the weather. A particularly ambitious commander once ordered a partial encirclement of a shipping lane, only to withdraw after realizing that the lane in question was no longer in use, having been abandoned the previous year due to declining interest in molasses. Supplies arrived regularly, though sometimes on the wrong ship, leading to minor but memorable overstocking of ginger root and a weeks-long shortage of flour that inspired a flurry of highly detailed pudding complaints. Meals were taken with ceremony. Officers dined at long tables set upon sloping decks, where the gentle rocking of the ship added a soft rhythm to the passing of boiled vegetables. Toasts were made to the crown, to the admiralty, to mild weather, and once, famously, to the enduring power of non-confrontational seafaring. No cannonballs were fired in anger, though several were dropped overboard by accident and recorded dutifully in the logbooks under miscellaneous losses. The men grew used to the routine. Watches were kept, ropes coiled and recoiled, hammocks swayed with the motion of nothing in particular. There was a brief excitement when a pod of dolphins was sighted approaching from the southeast, prompting a flurry of semaphore exchanges, only for the dolphins to veer off in apparent disinterest. An enemy ship did appear on the horizon one. Gray morning, but by the time anyone could agree on whether it posed a threat or merely resembled one, it had turned around and disappeared into a mist that wasn't even that thick. The incident was documented thoroughly and resulted in no change of course. Relations between the fleets, ours and theirs, remained curiously cordial. Though officially at war, it seemed impolite to act on it at sea, where one might ruin a perfectly lovely afternoon. Sailors from opposing ships occasionally waved. One enterprising midshipman claimed he could read lips and reported that an enemy officer had mouthed the word "nice" in reference to our vessel's rigging. While unconfirmed, this rumor lifted morale for nearly a week. Another sailor carved a chessboard into the deck and spent most of his days playing imaginary games against a French lieutenant he had invented in full detail, including a backstory involving a failed engagement and a fondness for oysters, perhaps the most dramatic moment of the entire blockade occurred not at sea, but in the writing of a letter describing it. A captain, determined to justify his prolonged inactivity, composed a 27-page dispatch full of nautical terminology, veiled criticisms of vague orders, and at least 3 metaphors comparing maritime patience to spiritual virtue. The letter took 4 days to write, 6 to dry, and never arrived, having been misrouted and eventually used as kindling by a cold clerk in a southern port who mistook it for shipping instructions. The incident went entirely unnoticed, back on the water. The ships continued their watchful waiting. No port was overtaken. No merchant vessels were seized. A single barge carrying onions was briefly hailed, and its captain replied that he had nothing of value besides onions. After a long silence, both parties agreed this did not warrant escalation. The blockade, such as it was, persisted with all the intensity of a Sunday nap. The wind blew, the sails flapped, and time passed without marking much of anything at all. And so the sea, vast and untroubled, remained exactly that, untroubled. The blockade became less a tactic than a tradition, a kind of naval pageantry performed for no one in particular, by men who had mastered the art of waiting beautifully. In the end, the ships would sail home with spotless decks, polished brass, and no stories to tell. But they would be received with honors nonetheless for having done their duty quietly, carefully, and without interruption, the most polite surrender. Welcome back to boring history for sleep, where even the word conquest arrives draped in velvet and followed by a long, quiet yawn. Tonight, we return to land, to a very small patch of it, in fact. A hilltop, if one's feeling generous. An outpost, if one insists on military terminology. It had a name, officially, but no one used it. Most simply called it the place with the goat, though it is unclear whether a goat had ever actually lived there. The structure was unimpressive, mostly timber and stone, with walls that leaned slightly in the wind. A guardhouse stood beside a half-dug latrine. A flag was hoisted, though usually at an angle, and often with the wrong emblem, depending on who remembered to check it that week. This was the site of the war's only official surrender, and it happened with such quiet cordiality that the soldiers involved almost forgot it had taken place. The outpost had been built a year earlier, with considerable ceremony and little urgency, designed to monitor a nearby river that no longer held tactical value. It had taken 6 months to complete, due in large part to a shortage of nails and the frequent need to remeasure things that had already been measured. The soldiers stationed there numbered exactly 6, including a corporal who spent most of his time attempting to teach a squirrel to. They kept a logbook that mostly recorded weather observations and the daily misplacement of the outposts. Only kettle. Morale was described on one particularly thoughtful day as quietly puzzled. They were not unhappy. These men just a little unsure what they were meant to be doing, or why they were the ones doing it. Then one misty morning, As the corporal adjusted the lean of the flagpole for the third time that week, a figure appeared on the road. Alone, on horseback, holding a letter and wearing the kind of expression one might associate with someone delivering an invitation to an event they themselves don't claim to attend. You technically the enemy, though you'd be hard-pressed to tell from his demeanor. The two sides had never met in this region. No shots had been fired. No threats issued. But it had been decided somewhere far away and weeks earlier that this outpost was to change hands. The letter explained as much in very polite phrasing, apologizing for any inconvenience and requesting, if possible. A smooth and timely transition. The corporal read the letter aloud to his men while they sat on crates, chewing on cold biscuits. No one objected. They agreed, after a brief and mostly silent discussion, that it seemed only fair. No defenses were prepared. No orders were barked. Instead, they tidied up. A broom was found somewhat miraculously. Loose tools were gathered. The firewood was stacked more neatly than usual. One soldier suggested they bake something to offer their replacements, but was reminded gently that flour had run out in March. By midday, the flag was lowered, not dramatically, not ceremonially, just quietly and folded with care. It would be sent home, though no one remembered the address. When the opposing force arrived that afternoon, itself no larger than a reading group and considerably less organized, the mood was not one of victory but mutual hesitation. A few handshakes were exchanged. There was an attempt at a salute, but it was unclear who should initiate. One of the new arrivals brought a pie as a gesture of goodwill, which turned out to be turnip-based and not especially popular. The two groups sat around for a while, chatting about the weather and the difficulties of long marches in damp boots. Eventually, the original garrison gathered their belongings, mostly notebooks and a tin cup with no handle, and began the short walk to a village nearby, where they were expected vaguely to await further orders. No shots were fired, no declarations made. The event was recorded in both sides' official logs with the exact same wording. Outpost surrendered. No incident. No delay. Rather nice, all considered. The new occupants settled in with a mild sense of confusion. They examined the structure, noted that the goat had never materialized, and took turns updating the logbook, which they agreed was mostly accurate, though needlessly poetic in some entries. The kettle remained elusive. The surrender would be referenced in future reports as a turning point, though no one could quite say in what direction. It was cited in speeches, footnotes, and once in a poorly attended military parade where it was briefly commemorated with a banner that read, "Successful transfer of control." The banner was reused a year later for a mayoral election in a neighboring district. The outpost itself would be abandoned again within months, left to the wind, the squirrels, and the slow reabsorption of nature. Only the logbook remained, in a drawer, chronicling days of minor rainfall, biscuit shortages, and the soft, forgettable changing of hands. And so, the only formal surrender of the most boring war you've never heard of came and went with barely a raised voice or misplaced boot, a gentle nod, a folded flag, and a pie no one wanted, forgotten and unfinished. Welcome back to boring history for sleep, where battles are postponed into oblivion and ambitions wither gently beneath layers of revised agendas and forgotten mail. Tonight's chapter, Forgotten and Unfinished, follows the slow, deliberate unraveling of what was, for a time, meant to be the war's grand culmination, a battle that never happened, a climax that never climbed, a finale not with a bang, but with the muffled thud of someone misplacing a crucial letter under a bowl of stewed parsnips. It was to be the moment when strategy met action, when troops moved, lines formed, and history tilted. Instead, it became an extended exercise in not doing anything at all quite thoroughly. The planning began with real enthusiasm of the administrative kind. There were maps spread across polished tables in government halls, little flags pushed into corkboards, committees formed to discuss the shape of the committees. One very detailed proposal outlined a pincer movement so slow and cautious that even the most ambitious generals admitted it might arrive a month after the enemy had already left. Another plan, drafted in neat copperplate script, hinged entirely on the assumption that the enemy would forget to show up. Still, the machinery of intention creaked into motion. Officers were summoned from their posts, some of whom had just unpacked their things, and meetings were held in rooms that smelled faintly of mothballs and lukewarm brandy. Yet, even in its early stages, the momentum faltered. There was the issue of boots, not the absence of them, but the inconsistency in their sizes. A quartermaster complained that every fourth pair squeaked. Then came the question of who would be in charge. 3 candidates were put forward. One, of whom was unavailable due to gout, another confused the eastern and western routes, and the third preferred not to lead anything more complicated than a breakfast rota. Funding was allocated, then paused, then reallocated with adjustments that mostly involved subtracting things, like tents and medical supplies in favor of ceremonial uniforms. Letters were sent and inevitably not received. One critical packet containing revised instructions and updated timetable was lost in a puddle after being handed off to a messenger who wasn't feeling terribly swift that day. By the time the first regiments began assembling, enthusiasm had cooled to something closer to gentle compliance. Soldiers arrived at the staging area to discover that the staging area had not yet been staged. Supplies sat in unopened crates. Officers wandered about, half-reading orders that contradicted those given the day before. The weather turned unhelpful, first with heavy rain, then with unexpected heat, then with a damp kind of fog that seemed to affect paperwork more than people. A small hill that was meant to serve as an observation post was found to be slightly too short, and a replacement hill proved to be mostly anthills and regret. Meanwhile, the enemy, whoever they were by this point, had seemingly moved on, possibly by accident, or perhaps in parallel confusion, leaving behind a campfire and a spoon. Rumors began to circulate. One said the entire plan had been cancelled already, and no one had been informed. Another claimed the battle had taken place in a different location, without most of the army present. A soldier reportedly overheard an aide to the general say, "We might just not do it," though this was said while buttering bread, and therefore could not be considered an official statement. Gradually, activity slowed. Routines returned. Boots were polished. Drills resumed. One officer tasked with preparing a charge spent 2 full days reorganizing the baggage carts and then left the next morning, having received a letter requesting his presence at a cousin's wedding. The letter had taken 3 weeks to arrive and was considered more pressing than any impending engagement back in the capital. Ministers began to speak of the operation in the past tense, as if its not happening had already occurred. The term, delayed indefinitely, was scribbled into margins. Maps were rolled up, plans quietly shelved. The official record of the proposed battle, when eventually compiled, contained exactly 4 pages. The first described the intended formations, the second noted a shortage of ink, the third was entirely blank, and the fourth simply read, "To be continued, possibly." The war itself had grown thin like tea, left steeping too long, losing its urgency, losing its shape. The people involved were no longer quite sure if it was still a war or just a habit. And the great battle, with all its potential for strategy, movement, and confusion, faded softly into nothing. No one mourned its absence. There were no commemorations, no monuments, not even a nickname. Those who had trained for it returned to their former posts, or took up quiet duties in quieter towns. One unit, having marched in the wrong direction for a week, decided to simply stay where they were, having grown fond of a particular tree. Another dissolved entirely after realizing no one had been keeping roll. The war moved on, or rather gently drifted toward its ending, without ever pausing to ask whether it needed one peace talks begin. Eventually, welcome back to boring. History for sleep, where we're just one yawn away from resolution. Tonight's episode, Peace Talks Begin, eventually, is less about diplomacy in action and more about diplomacy in theory long afternoons spent waiting for couriers. Ink smudges on unsigned treaties and tea that went cold while everyone wondered whether the other side had already agreed to something or not. This is the nearly final chapter of our long and sleepy journey through through the most boring war you've never heard of. And true to form, the end is not a conclusion, but a polite drift into paperwork and mutual FRGETFULNES static. Began, as so many slow things do, with a letter. Not a dramatic declaration, not an ultimatum, but a gentle inquiry folded carefully, sealed with soft wax, and carried by a man who walked more than he rode because his horse had developed a persistent limp. The letter, written in handwriting, that had begun to lose its edge from boredom more than fatigue, requested the possibility of a meeting. Not immediately, of course. The weather was unpredictable. The roads, muddy, and several of the people who would need to be present were either indisposed, uncertain, or simply unaware they had been nominated to attend. So the proposed date was set 3 weeks in the future, subject to change, and preferably after the harvest. When the other side received the letter, they were unsure who should read it first. The most senior official was away visiting a cousin who may or may not have been ill, and the junior diplomat who opened the envelope accidentally tore a corner of the parchment, leading to a mild panic about whether the tone of the message had somehow been compromised. After a day of quiet internal meetings to decide how to interpret the phrase, a mutually agreeable location, they decided to draft a response. This took 4 days, not because the letter was long, but because it had to be translated twice first from formal bureaucratic language into something readable, and then back into formal language again, just in case anyone important decided to glance at it. The response was sent by river, as the roads were once again deemed unsuitable for diplomatic urgency. Eventually a date was set. A place was chosen, though only after several candidates were ruled out due to flooding, rumors of damp sheets, or the unfortunate tendency of one village inn to serve very sour fish. The final choice was a manor. House that had once belonged to a noble family who had long since moved away, leaving behind a handful of confused staff and an overgrown garden filled with thistles. When the diplomats arrived, though not all at once, as several parties misread the directions, they were greeted with tepid cider and a fire that refused to stay lit. There were no grand welcomes, and no banners. Just the creak of boots on old floorboards and the soft sound of chairs being shuffled around a table that was slightly too small for the group. The first day of talks was mostly silence. Everyone was waiting for someone else to begin. Papers were arranged, then rearranged. Tea was poured. One man sneezed repeatedly, prompting speculation about whether it was nerves or mild allergy to the dust that coated everything from the table legs to the windowsills. Finally, someone cleared their throat and said, well, then, which was, strictly speaking, not a position, but it did break the ice. A list of grievances was produced, many of which had already been resolved by accident, neglect, or the slow march of time. One demand involved the return of a small boat that had sunk the previous spring. Another involved access to a particular footpath that no longer existed. After some discussion, everyone agreed that perhaps the details weren't as important as the sentiment. And that sentiment, broadly speaking, was that everyone had had quite enough of whatever this was. Each day followed much the same pattern. A slow arrival, lukewarm discussions, a long lunch involving boiled roots and soft bread, more discussions that often wandered into side topics: taxation, postal routes, the reliability of boots before being steered back gently toward the idea of peace. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone of anything outright. The closest thing to a confrontation came when one representative questioned whether a certain border marker had ever existed, to which the response was, possibly. The issue was set aside for future clarification, and then quietly forgotten. On the fourth day it rained heavily. One of the chimneys began to drip. The fire sputtered. Ink ran on a copy of the third draft of a tentative agreement, which led to a brief delay while a scribe rewrote it in cleaner script, though he took the opportunity to edit some of the phrasing, replacing immediately with in due course and final resolution, with a conclusion acceptable to most. These changes were accepted without question. The new version of the treaty was passed around for signatures, though one pen refused to write and the other leaked slightly. A new pen was requested from town, which took a day and a half by the end of the week. Nothing was signed, but everyone agreed it had gone rather well. Plans were made to reconvene. No one could remember whether the next meeting was to be held in the same manor house or a nearby tavern that reportedly had excellent porridge. Messages were sent to confirm, though one messenger was bitten by a dog and delayed, while another took a wrong turn and spent the night in the wrong village, eating a stew made from what he hoped was turnip. Meanwhile, back home, government officials received updates that said very little. One minister read a report that consisted entirely of the sentence, "Talks are progressing at an agreeable pace, pending clarification." No one asked for clarification. Eventually, a version of the treaty was drafted that included no new provisions and made no claims of victory. It simply acknowledged that hostilities, such as they were, should be paused or concluded, or considered more or less complete, depending on one's perspective. It was written in soft, rounded phrases. It did not name anyone as winner or loser. It included generous spacing, thoughtful punctuation, and a polite note at the end thanking all parties for their patience. When it was finally signed on in, overcast morning with birds singing faintly outside, the moment passed almost without notice. A scribe coughed. Someone asked about the next carriage departure. One of the inkpots tipped slightly, staining the corner of the tablecloth, which caused mild concern and a brief discussion about laundering options. And just like that, the war was more or less over. Not with ceremony, not with applause. Simply, with a signature and a general feeling that something had concluded, or at least slowed to the point where it no longer needed to be discussed. The diplomats departed, some of them forgetting parts of their luggage. The manor house was cleaned half-heartedly. The staff resumed their quiet routines. And somewhere, in an office not far from the capital, a clerk filed a treaty under miscellaneous resolved. Aftermath of a war that never really happened. Welcome back. One last time to boring history for sleep. Tonight we conclude our soft-spoken odyssey with part 16. Aftermath of war that never really happened. There are no victory parades, no dramatic ruins, and no enduring legends to speak of. Just the quiet, paper-thin echoes of a war that passed like a half-remembered conversation at the end of a long hallway. The dust settles slowly, the ledgers close with a faint sigh, and history tucks this whole affair into the bottom drawer unlabeled, unstaring, and mostly unread. When the final version of the peace agreement was signed, ink barely dry. No. Celebration planned word took its time trickling back to those who had once been involved. Messages were sent, yes, but not urgently. One courier took a long detour to visit his grandmother. Another fell asleep on a barge and drifted gently past his destination, waking up 2 towns too far downstream. By the time soldiers heard the news, many had already assumed the war was over anyway, or had forgotten it had officially begun. One regiment, still camped in a wooded valley they were never meant to enter, received the peace declaration folded into a copy of an outdated potato inventory. They nodded, set it aside, and resumed doing very little in towns and garrisons and temporary outposts. There was no rush to demobilize. Some stayed where they were simply because it was comfortable. A few detachments drifted home over the course of weeks, sometimes months, without ceremony or farewell. Horses were slowly unhitched. Boots were polished out of habit. The war hadn't left scars, not even emotional ones, just a vague, lingering sense of interruption. At best, it had been an inconvenience. At worst, it had been a long period of standing around and wondering who had the key to the supply tent. As men returned to their villages and farms, they weren't greeted as heroes. Mostly, they were offered lukewarm soup and asked where they had been. Some tried to explain, but it wasn't easy. There was a war, they'd say, and then hesitate. Well, sort of. It made for poor storytelling. Administrators had their own version of the aftermath. Desks were cleared slowly. Crates of unused paperwork were labeled pending, archived, and stacked in corners. Reports were written in triplicate, describing events that never quite happened. A general, once poised to lead a grand offensive, quietly retired without ever commanding a real battle, though he was awarded a ceremonial medal in the shape of a quill. It was meant to represent strategic restraint, though it mostly symbolized inaction. His acceptance speech consisted of the words, "Ah," followed by a lengthy pause. No one noticed when he left the stage. The war, if it was won, failed to shape policy. There were no treaties redrawing maps, no shifts in borders, no rise or fall of empires. In government chambers, it was mentioned less and less, until finally not at all. A few members of parliament remembered it vaguely as that thing with the biscuit. Scholars didn't rush to publish analyses. One academic attempted a monograph, but abandoned the project after realizing there was no clear beginning, middle, or end. His notes conclude with the phrase, and then it sort of didn't matter. History books, when they mentioned it at all, gave it a line or two. An undeclared conflict of limited engagement, one wrote. A diplomatic misunderstanding prolonged by weather, said another. One textbook misspelled the name of the war entirely, and no one corrected it. School children, when forced to study the era, found it confusing. Was there a war? They'd ask. Well, their teacher would reply, that depends who you ask, and when, and why. The students nodded, wrote down a sentence, and moved on. But perhaps in a small and peculiar way, that was the point. Not every war is remembered in marble or ash. Some end without endings. Some never quite begin. Some are carried forward only in the memory of those who stood around waiting, and in the faded ink of forms never filed. There's something oddly human in a war whose greatest legacy is its own failure to escalate. A conflict composed not of cannon fire, but of missing rations, forgotten maps, and the slow drift of people doing their best to appear busy dot, and so we end not with triumph or sorrow, but with a kind of comfortable fog. Nothing was won. Nothing was truly lost. The world kept turning. Birds kept singing. The post office resumed its usual errors, and the great war that wasn't quite a war faded into the soft folds of time. Where it rests now, barely stirring, like a letter never sent or a dream half forgotten before breakfast. And with that, we close the final chapter of The Most Boring, a war you've never heard of. Thank you for coming along this very gentle journey. A journey not of battles or bloodshed, but of soggy tense, poorly kept minutes, and the long, slow shuffle of inaction. May your night be uneventful, your dreams disorganized, and your sleep as deep and undisturbed as a diplomatic meeting that no one remembered to attend. Sleep well.